Welcome back to the Buddy Ruski Show. My guest today is Jed Byrne. Jed, thanks for being on the show today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jed is a community developer based out of Raleigh. We've had a number of really interesting conversations, as you all know, following Buddy Ruski for however long you have. I talk about development a lot. I think about it a lot. And Jed has really opened my mind to the mechanics of development, how projects are put together, maybe some gaps, well, definitely some gaps in my knowledge around development. And so I definitely wanted to talk about that today, because I think that you all will get as much out of this conversation as I have talking to Jed. But also, there are seemingly few community developers in our midst. You know, when we think about development in the Triangle, we often think about, big business coming in and developing these huge high rises and what that means for our communities. And so I think Jed brings a really interesting perspective, being more on the ground level and being able to speak both as a developer and as a member of our community of Raleigh and the Triangle at large. And so his perspective is really interesting, and I'm excited to have him share that with us today. But first, as we do with all the guests on the show, I'd love to rewind and kind of start at the beginning. You were not necessarily interested in development from the jump. Your folks were not in development, but you found your way into this industry. So I'd love to hear more about your upbringing and kind of how we make our way into the Jed Byrne that we have today. So to start, you mentioned in our pre-show call that you're from Maryland. For me, whenever I think of Maryland, I think of Baltimore and The Wire. I'm a huge fan of The Wire. And one of the things, as I've rewatched it over time, thinking about The Wire, is it's as much a show about community development as it is crime. A lot of people think of The Wire as being a big crime show, but it is a show about development. How much growing up in Maryland as a young person were you thinking about development?
Yeah, that's a good question. And when you sent me that email, I kind of chuckled to myself. So I grew up, I guess one place to start with the development conversation, and as it goes to The Wire, I grew up in Baltimore County, which is an interesting distinction in Maryland. Baltimore City, the city of Baltimore, is separated from the county, and the county kind of surrounds the city. And so I did not know much about that history or the dynamics of that. But as I grew older and as I read more and learned more and got into the industry, there are a lot of heartbreaking and tragic and difficult conversations around why Baltimore City looks different from a from a demographic standpoint, from a racial standpoint, than Baltimore County. So for people who can't, I am Caucasian. I'm a white male. So where I grew up looked different than Baltimore City, and why is that? It wasn't an accident. There are a lot of laws and hate and bigotry and lots of just very complicated, ugly things that cause that dynamic. And again, as a kid growing up, you don't think about that. Nobody really talks about it.
Yeah, certainly not part of the educational curriculum.
No.
The idea of redlining was something that I learned only a couple years ago.
Yeah.
When we talk about the way that communities are structured, and even the racism that has sort of is a part of the fabric of our country, unfortunately. Something like redlining was never really a huge part of that, but it drives so much. I mean, land ownership is a huge part of wealth developing within a family and a community. And so, it certainly could really section off communities.
100%. And that's, so one thing, if folks haven't read the book, The Color of Law. That's something, and I read that, and I'll get back to the kind of the backstory of Jed in a second, but that book speaks specifically to the racial segregation in Baltimore. And so like I'm reading the book and I was like, oh man, ouch. Like, I feel that directly. And again, and by no means as directly as the families and history that I had it. I had it pretty good, right? And there's a lot of people that felt the negative aspects of that, but you can see it, and it's talked directly in the book. And then I went to Clemson University. The book talks about Clemson University. I'm a big member or big advocate for Urban Land Institute. The Color of Law talks about ULI, and it's not that I felt like attacked, but it was interesting just to see how my history. It's just on every other page, and it was not something that was talked about. Nobody at ULI talks about that. Nobody in Baltimore County City talks about it. Maybe they do now. I've been gone for 18, 20 years, but it's interesting that it's land use is something, and as it pertains to the wire, right? Is the wire a crime or gang or drugs show? Maybe, but I'm biased in that land use is my profession, so I think about land use all the time. But I can draw connections and correlations in most things in life to land use choices, regulation, policy. It's not always the cause, but you can see direct connections in a lot of things, and that's why I'm so passionate about it, because it's so important. It's all around us. I mean, we're in a building now, right? Like so the way we can record this is because somebody at some point had an idea to build a building, and that building had a basement, and here we are, recording in this studio. So there's land use and development interwoven, I think, throughout almost everything in life. And so that was a new discovery to me, and it took time. When I was growing up, originally, in high school, I was more interested in business. So my first real interaction with development was, I have an uncle who's a developer in Baltimore and Florida, and I didn't really know that at the time. I just always thought of him as being in business. He was a businessman. I always thought that was interesting and exciting. So when I was in high school, I said, well, I'm going to go into business. That just seems, like a reasonable thing to do. I had no idea what that really meant. And so I'd applied to all these colleges where they had business programs, but again, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And then very late in my senior year, completely changed gears and said, well, actually, I like taking things apart and figuring things out. So maybe I want to be an engineer. And you may know this about me, but I'm severely ADHD. So like attention and excitement, and also I'm all over the place. So it's not surprising to me looking back that I did a complete 180. But so went to Clemson University for mechanical engineering, studied that, thought I was going to be interested in the automotive engineering program, changed gears again into more of a just kind of general mechanical curriculum, and they let you choose. And so I thought in my mind, again, I don't really know what I want to do, but mechanical engineering is fairly broad. And so if I graduate with a mechanical engineering degree, there's a lot of things I can do. It can't be a bad thing. Graduated, went to work for a company that was in the oil and gas EPC, which is engineering, procurement, and construction industry. So we built and designed storage tanks. And so we were building these really large scale, like if you drive through Greensboro, you see the big oil terminals. We built tanks like that and water towers. And so we spent about 5 years in that career, moving all over the country. And so I got to experience a whole bunch of different communities, again, from living in one place most of my life for the first 18 years to going to South Carolina, which was different from where I grew up, to moving to Houston, to moving to California in the Bay Area, moving back to Houston. I lived in Aruba for a little bit. But so I got to see different places, ultimately wound up in Atlanta. And again, so kind of the wheels started turning, and I guess really getting kind of cranked up about land use and development while I was moving around. The other thing, to go completely back to my childhood for development for me, one of the kind of seminal moments was when I was a kid in Baltimore City. There was an old, I want to say it was like a fish cannery, some sort of fish processing plant that was right downtown. And they were, I guess the city or the county, somebody, the city, I suppose, bought it, and they were going to redevelop it into the Children's Museum. So think kind of like Marbles in Raleigh. And I actually had the chance through my parents of doing a tour when it was still under construction. And so I would go into this building, and there's 60-foot ceilings and big old windows and brick and concrete and steel columns and just kind of this big old 150-year-old building. and it was just cool. And I just remember walking in, and I was probably 10, and looking around, and the guy who was giving us the tour said, well, here's going to be this piece, and there's going to be this big slide coming down, and all these different, and you could just see their passion for the future and this kind of vision, and there was nothing there yet. I mean, there was the building, but there, none of those things existed yet. And so seeing that, and then coming back a year later and going through the museum, and all the things that they talked about were there, and so you could see somebody, you take this asset, which is a building, which is a piece of land, which is history, which is the surroundings, all the context, everything that goes along with that building, hopefully everything, if you do it right, everything, or most things. But you take those assets and then you add some stuff and some effort and some finance and all these different components to it and a vision, and then you come out with something different and hopefully better. And again, that to me is kind of the developer's story is, and I know developer, we've talked about this as, a dirty word in a lot of conversations, but it is the kind of hub of the wheel. They don't do any one thing particularly well, but they got to do everything a little bit. And you got to have a vision. You got to have access to capital. You got to have experts on your team. You have to have all these bits and pieces. But that to me is taking something, adding something to it, and coming out with something different. And so those were kind of the two, both my uncle and the Children's Museum story were kind of early sparks in my development career. But after being out of school for a few years, I realized, I like construction. I like building things. When I would travel for work, I could look out the window of a plane and, somebody says, well, you sell water towers. What's that all about? And so I could point out the window and say, well, there's like 12 water towers. Most people don't think about water towers or infrastructure. And say, well, water towers aren't that big of a deal. And I'm like, look, you can see them. They're all over the place. So I like that you can do something and point to it. I like that it's going to be around a long time. I like working with people and solving problems. I just didn't like tanks. And so ultimately, I got interested and introduced to the business school at UNC, where in the MBA program, they have a concentration in real estate development and finance. And so went that route, came out and worked in multifamily development in Charlotte, worked in office finance and development up here in Raleigh, worked in mixed-use development, now currently work for an engineering firm. So I feel like I've touched a lot of the different bases of, and taught at UNC, the online MBA program for a little bit. So through all that, learned about land use, learned about the learned kind of how it happens. And in that, I became more educated about it. But you also see that there's a few people who know a lot about it and understand how it works. And it's very complicated. It's not, I don't think it's difficult. I think of inventing new things is difficult, and curing cancer is difficult. Land use and construction and development is not difficult, but it's very complicated. And so there aren't a ton of people who understand all of those complications. And so as I've discovered that, I became more interested in not only doing the things, but helping people understand those things. And I think that's where you and I started conversations, because again, I think of as a community, if we all understand what's going on and how the things work, we can work together to make the outcomes better. And again, I think none of us are as smart as all of us. I don't think I'm terribly smart. A lot of developers I know aren't terribly smart. They just sit in a position where they understand how things work. And so again, it's just complicated. And because land use touches everything and is everywhere, when I build a building here or somebody builds this building here, that means that nothing else is going to be here for 100 years, hopefully. Depending on how the development goes, but it's permanent, and it has externalities that are positive and negative. And I believe firmly in the positive externalities of development, but there are very real negative externalities. And so if I do something and it impacts you, if you and I can work together to have a better outcome, it's better for you and it's better for me. And I think development in a nutshell is all about creating value. And so part of that's financial value, but part of that's also, I think, heavily community-driven value. And so that's why I'm super passionate about having these conversations. If anybody ever has questions about development or how it works, I love talking about it. So I think that maybe answers part of your story. Oh, no, the one thing, back to The Wire. So, and remind me, who is the character that you reference?
Stringer.
Stringer.
Yeah, Idris Elba's character.
I don't want to do spoiler alerts. I feel like we're past that. So I won't say, I think it doesn't end up super well for him, if I recall.
It does not.
Okay, so it doesn't end up super well for him. But there is that story, and I think that as people, are invest in a community, I think that's one angle that often, if you have the ability to do so, is investing in real estate. And so some people do that on a commercial level or on a larger scale. A lot of people do it on a personal level in buying a home. And again, there's intricacies and complications with that. And as a community, as we have these discussions, back to the externalities, the decisions we make at a community level could impact home values. And in a world where the average homeowner, and I'm making this up, but say has 50% of their personal wealth tied up in the value of their home, when you start fiddling with that equation, people get real antsy, and it gets complicated, and people get angry, and the impacts are real, and it's complicated. And so I love participating in those conversations. I think the more we can do that as a community, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and we can hop off the wire train here in a second, but the reason I brought it up is because he, as a person participating in the drug game, uses real estate or sees real estate as an opportunity to move out of that. He ends up going to community college to take these business courses. His aspiration for his crew is to start sort of moving some of that drug money into real estate so that they can move into a quote unquote clean business, and start to build wealth in that regard. And real estate and development is the way that he sees that they're going to be able to build that wealth in a way that's sustainable. So it's interesting. That's, one of the ways that I think The Wire kind of speaks to that dynamic, the developer dynamic.
Well, it's cash flow. I mean, it's you're investing in an asset, and there's lots of ways to do that. Stock market, that you can invest in many assets that produce value over time. And so, right, if you invest a chunk of money up front and it pays back a percentage of that over time, right. So if market conditions change, whether you're Stringer or somebody else, you have this thing that's working on your behalf. That can be a financially positive thing, and it's just, again, it's a story as old as time. But that, again, I think most people, and nor should they, but understand the financial implications of that, how that works, how people invest in real estate, what are people's options, and then how those choices impact community, because they do.
You mentioned going to Clemson for mechanical engineering. But both your parents and your sister, if I'm not mistaken, were dentists.
Yeah.
Did you ever consider dentistry as a profession? You were never sort of drawn to that?
No, I think your question was, was dentistry not good enough? So yeah, so I come from a very dental heavy family, which is fine. And no, I just never thought about it. It was not an anti thing, but again, I had the option to go off and explore what I wanted to study, and so I did, and that was, for whatever reason, was never interesting to me. In hindsight, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and still, I don't think I really knew what I wanted to do until I went to grad school, because I remember going in thinking, well, shoot, if this development thing doesn't work out, or it's just not what I want to do, or it's not where my passion is, or I'm not good at it, again, having a business degree and an engineering degree, like, there are worse problems in the world. And so I think for a long part of my life, and still to this day, I think kind of divergently, and I try to give myself as many options as possible. And now I think I'm trying to hopefully converge again onto something, because again, I've got limited resources and time and money, and everything that I do has an opportunity cost. So how can I make sure I'm focused somewhat for a super ADHD person to hopefully, have some sort of impact in this life.
You talked about the different traveling you did early in your career, going out to the Bay, to Houston, to Atlanta. What did you see being in those different areas, and how they were tackling this problem of development and building communities? And what did you take from that as you moved through your career?
So, I've had the opportunity to travel and live in different markets. I've had the opportunity to travel overseas and see different cities. And I think one of the things that's most interesting to me is not really a development observation, but more like a psychology of things, where, people in Atlanta complain about traffic all the time, and Houston, and like when I lived in Houston, I would regularly drive to visit friends on the other side of town, and that's 60 miles, and it takes forever and a day to get there. And it was like, no sweat, that's just what you did. That was the culture. Like everybody's used to driving everywhere. And I don't know that people really stop and think like, well, why? Why is it that, Houston is so wide and vast, and that my only option is to get in a car and drive to the other side of town, and the other side of town being an hour. I mean, when I was in Maryland, if I drove an hour north or south, I was in different states. I mean, it's crazy. I don't think people stop and think about these decisions and implications, and it almost seems like everybody feels victim to the decisions that are made out there. Like it happens, but as a community, we're all partially responsible. It's like when we drive around Raleigh or into Durham or wherever, people complain about traffic. Like, well, I'm in the car, I am traffic. Like that's, I got to claim some responsibility for that. Or if we complain about traffic but don't invest in things to mitigate traffic or an alternate to traffic, nothing changes. There are lots of conversations about density and changing of land use and zoning and all these different things, and it's just, again, my personal stance, although I have opinions, and as you know, I'm happy to share them. When I'm engaging with people, I try not to tell people what I think is right, because in my opinion, it's kind of irrelevant. I would much rather hear what you think so that I can learn from you, and so I can get your perspective and I can understand that, and I like collecting information and learning. And so that's super valuable to me. It's just, hey, what do you think about this thing? So I can understand what you think. But, there are plenty of people out there that would be opposed to, commercial uses coming into their neighborhood and being allowed in their neighborhood. And you say, well, it could be a cigarette store or some other, vice or something that we don't want. But when you go on vacation to Savannah or Charleston or some other place, and you're like, oh my gosh, we left the hotel and we walked down the street and there's this cute little coffee shop and I just loved it. And the owner was a local and we talked, and it was so great. Or, we got there and we just, we hopped on the bus or the train and we got around everywhere, and it was so wonderful. And then you come home and you just like forget like all of those things that you enjoyed. And you're like, no, I'm not going to give up my parking space. And no, I don't want to, there's traffic on this road, so we've got to expand it. And it's just the psychological dynamics of land use, I think, are fascinating. And I don't have an answer. I wish I did. But when you talk to people and hear what they value and what they theoretically want, and then you see the decisions that we make as individuals, including myself. I mean, I drove here. Like, I'm not going to tell you, and we've had conversations about biking and transportation, but I drove from Raleigh to Durham because it was 45 minutes. Technically, I came from Clayton, so I came far away. But, I drove here because to take a bus or a train would be, I don't know, hours. It wouldn't happen. I could not sit here if that was my option. And so I think it's the big takeaway, and it's as true here as any other market I've ever been in, is there seems to be a big disconnect in between what people say they want and think they want and value, and then how they act. And I think that's true in all sorts of things. That's true in personal health. That's true in finance. I mean, it's just, I guess it's human nature. But it is very interesting to hear those conversations. And I think one of the things I'm really passionate about is helping people understand and answer questions that they may have, and have those conversations, because I think it's all around us and we can become kind of blind to it. But it's little things like sidewalks and benches and, shady spots in the sun and plazas and all these different things. And again, allowing, commercial use in a residential neighborhood. Yeah, it could be, some store that you don't like. It could be a record shop. But again, if you say it can't, if you take off the table the possibility that it can be a record shop or a vape shop or something that and again, nothing wrong with record shops, but like vape shops or something just that is a negative, you're also taking off the table a lot of other options. I mean, there's a lot of things that come along with that exclusion, and that's a topic we can talk about. But, in zoning, I think we've gone a long way for a long time, for 100 years, of zoning by exclusion and exclusionary zoning and inclusionary zoning, inclusion, I'm not going to spell it. Inclusionary zoning, I think, is becoming a more hot topic these days as affordability has just peaked into being atrocious in Durham and Raleigh and lots of places in North Carolina. But one of the things I think most people don't think about is like, yes, inclusion, bringing things into the fold is a good choice, but also what have we done? What have we excluded for 100 years? And what are the impacts that those choices have had? I think matter probably more. And again, far be it for me to convince someone or tell somebody what to do, but I like having those conversations. So you think about it and you decide, okay, no, I like this. I like, everybody getting an acre all to themselves, and that's the only choice, and that's fine. But that has impacts, and that has future states. And if you're not also fine with those future states, then we should reconsider or think about that.
Yeah, the point about it not being what you observe, not being necessarily about development, but psychology is really interesting because a lot of that gets baked into the culture of a place in a way that it's so hard to pull out of that. And those choices that communities make, that governments make, they start to stack on top of each other. And if you try to pull one out, the whole Jenga tower falls apart. And so it just becomes part of that area. You think about LA or Houston, Atlanta. My dad lives down there, and yeah, it's like such a pain to get anywhere because you're just stuck in a car, and it has climate implications. It has like psychological implications in terms of stress. Like no one is thrilled to be in traffic. But to your point, we also don't really make choices then to mitigate that or to change that behavior because it becomes so a part of what we think our community is. Yeah. And breaking from that is really difficult. And I wonder, I do think conversations like this and just more conversations in our community are important so that people have an understanding of how things get built, how communities are created. To your point, like if you take things off the table or put them on the table, what ripple effects those have, and being really honest about it. Yeah. That is really a way for us to rethink our communities at this very pivotal point, particularly here in the Triangle with affordability, with climate implications. Yeah. So yeah, it is, human nature is a very strange thing and hard to assess sometimes, but yeah, it will take us sort of coming together and rethinking how we want to, piece together our communities.
I mean, I think it takes leadership, which is challenging, right? Because there's one aspect of it where it's community leadership, where the community gets together and says, this is what we want. We want these things. Because again, I don't think any of these problems are impossible or even they're difficult for sure. They're complicated, but they're not super, super hard. Like we understand how to get, 10,000 people an hour moving along a path from here to there. I mean, there are plenty of places, and I'm making that math up, but like if you want to move a lot of people from one place to another, there are solutions out there. We are far, at least here in the Triangle, far from hitting those limits. Like there are places where you're hitting the limit. We're not near the limits. And so I think it takes leadership either from, or hopefully in concert, the community or elected officials or corporate, it takes somebody stepping out, and there's a chicken and the egg problem too, especially when it comes to transportation or land use in general, where it's like, well, if we invest heavily in buses, well, no one's riding the buses. Well, is nobody riding the buses? And I say no one. It's not no one. There are plenty of people that ride the buses, and buses are extremely important. But I think people often balk at investing in something for the future when the use isn't there yet. Or bike lanes, right? Like, well, I see bike lanes, they're empty all the time. Why are we building more bike lanes? It's like, well, maybe nobody rides on your bike lane because it's a 45 mile an hour bike lane or 45 mile an hour road, and you're riding on that road as a bike, as a squishy person. Maybe there's that. And so there's chicken and the egg.
There's definitely that.
There's chicken and the egg problems. And again, that's a simple thing. It's like, hey, listen, let's get people out on bikes and ride on our infrastructure. And then you come and tell me, is that something you want to experience? If the answer is yes, great, go for it. Let's roll. But if it's not, what can we do about it? And then you mentioned Jenga. I think a lot about like Kerplunk, which I think it's Kerplunk, but it's the tube where you stick all the little kind of needles through it, and then you have the marbles on the top. And so again, like the marbles can get by one plastic noodle or needle or piece of spaghetti, no problem. But you add 50 and they stop. And so again, all of these things, all of these choices that we make in and of themselves probably don't have huge implications. And we started off at Color of Law. So like there are definitely choices that people have made and can make and threaten to make and may make that have direct and huge implications. But a lot of stuff doesn't. But it adds up over time to stress the system in a negative way, or it adds up over time to benefit a system in a positive way. And so again, that to me, that's the crux. Is like, if everybody understands all those things, then great, we solved that problem. I just don't think we're there yet. And so that's I don't know. Maybe I can help explain or have those conversations or ask those questions. Because from what I've seen, yeah, we're not there yet.
I want to take a quick break and then we'll come right back. What's up, everyone? Popping in to say that if you haven't already, subscribe to the Buddy Ruski newsletter. Not only will you get alerted when new episodes drop, but you'll stay up to date on all things Buddy Ruski, including new content on the blog, upcoming projects, and more. You can subscribe at buddyruski.com. Also, if you have feedback about the show or anything else you'd like to share, stories you're interested in, or people you think I should interview, my inbox is open. You can email me at justin@buddyruski.com. All right, back to the episode. So earlier when you were breezing through your bio, you mentioned that you graduated from Clemson in 2007. Right around that same time, as everyone knows, there was a huge housing crisis that crippled a lot of families, sort of just like, crashed through our economy, our communities. Did that in any way shape your the direction of your career, or even people in your orbit that were also thinking about real estate development, engineering? Were there a lot of folks that were like, ooh, maybe not real estate now. Maybe I'm going to rethink my post-college plans.
No, so it did and it didn't. The most direct impact that it had that I remember was when I was working for my first company out of undergrad. So I graduated before the recession, and then my first time back to Clemson after graduating was to recruit the following year for people in my the same position that I'd been hired for. And I remember coming across somebody who on paper had all the same credentials. I mean, to a T, same internship, same degree, better grades, and better experience because their parents grew up in the industry or like worked in the industry. My parents are dentists. Their parents were in the industry that we worked in. So like they had been through, all these international movings and working in Saudi Arabia for the refineries and all this stuff that I had just no exposure to. And ultimately, I mean, again, a better qualified person not only didn't get a job, but didn't get an interview offer. And the only difference was time. I mean, and I will never forget that. If I had graduated 1 year later, I would not have gotten the job that I got. And again, it wasn't in real estate, but that was very obvious to me. And what that did, though, in the land use industry is there were plenty of people that came out with civil engineering degrees and finance degrees and that would have gone to work for home builders or in the trades. You saw a lot of people who were in construction, who were in design that got laid off. I mean, the development activity just stopped. I mean, it didn't trickle; it just went to zero, and it was awful. And so a lot of people lost their jobs, lost their homes. I mean, it was catastrophic economically and professionally, and so they just didn't come back. And so what you're seeing now, and again, this isn't directly related to me, but I'm in this weird kind of in between, where now in the development and land use space, their architecture firms are looking for architects with 10 years of experience who graduated in 2008, and they're just few and far between. 2009, I mean, the kind of 8 through 12, 13 time frame, those 5 years, a lot of people were like, ooh, I wanted to go do that thing, but I'm not gonna. Seems like a really bad idea. So there was just what's the opposite of glut?
Drought, I guess.
Drought, yeah. So there's a drought in the professions and in the trades. And again, that's a lot of what you're seeing now is there's all this demand and there isn't enough capacity to build the buildings, to make the things, to design the thing. I mean, it's just, it's crazy, again, how everything is connected. And again, if nothing else, as humans, everything we do is all interconnected. But that is interesting to me. So it didn't really impact directly my desire, but I think it's definitely part of my story. And as I was out there, I mean, really, I could see both the positive and negative impacts of the built environment as I got more exposure to that. Again, I've never figured out a better way to describe it other than buildings are cool, and like, again, we're sitting in this studio that someone had an idea, right? And someone years and years ago had an idea to build some walls and to, invest in this location. And because of this kind of cascade of ideas and visions and investments and all this stuff, all these actions lead us up to here. That's just cool. I mean, and it's fun, and having some teeny tiny little part in that is fascinating. And again, I think as individuals you can have direct impact, but part of the reason why I like having these conversations and talking to people is because I think that scales a little bit better. You can have multiple conversations a day, or you can have a podcast and a bunch of people can listen to it, or a bunch of people can ask questions and engage. And I think that really is where kind of the rubber meets the road.
And I know you graduated from Clemson with a degree in mechanical engineering in 2007, and then 5 years later, made your way into real estate finance and development as a graduate student at UNC. Was there something within those 5 years that changed, that you observed, that made you, reconsider, entering that discipline as opposed to just staying on the mechanical engineering route?
Yeah. So what it was I realized, I had the privilege of moving all over the country, and I was in a rotational training program. So for the first 2.5 years, I had, 5 or 6 different jobs. And so I got to try marketing, I got to try construction, I got to try operations, I got to try business development and, communications. I mean, I did all these different things. And so I started kind of looking at my career and skills and what I enjoyed doing, and realized that the missing piece was buildings, right? So I like talking to people. I like solving problems. I like building things. I like working on complicated issues and, working on something tangible. I like building things, like whether it's a little thing like a podcast or writing an article, or, I used to brew beer in college, like cracking open a beer, or just doing something that you made and giving it to somebody and seeing that kind of transfer of value of like, I tried to do this thing. Again, I had a vision to do this thing, and it's silly, it's beer, but like that was one of the first starts of that, where like you can have an idea and study and try and design and get feedback and iterate and do all these different things, and then you literally have this thing that you give to somebody else.
Something tactile.
And they, in beer, they take a sip, and sometimes they say, man, that's really good. Sometimes they say it's awful. But like that whole experience of building something from an idea to something tactile is huge to me. And so when I was in the tank business, the only box that wasn't checked was the buildings piece, because at the end of the day, it was all those things for water towers, or all of those things for a tank and a refinery. And to me, buildings just seemed more exciting. And so I had the opportunity to go to business school. And in that, I knew I'd be able to do an internship for the summer and try it out. And again, if all else failed, I'd have options, but I'd be able to learn and grow and build a network and, be around really smart people and have access to really smart people, and ask my questions and then try it. And that was huge. And so that's kind of what made the transition. And then kind of once I got the taste of it, there's no looking back.
You mentioned that there's this drought of folks, partly because of the housing crisis, being in this industry. And I wonder too, talking about building tactile things, there's also this in the late 2000s, early 2010s, this resurgence of the startup, and particularly the software tech startup. And I wonder how many of those folks, as opposed to getting into more tactile engineering positions, saw the growth opportunity financially, and also just thinking about tech was a very cool new thing for people to be a part of at that time. And I wonder how much that industry siphoned off folks who would have otherwise become mechanical engineers as opposed to software developers or something like that.
So I think that's a great question. I don't know that I've ever thought about it in a tech versus development conversation, but I think it's directly applicable. I think what you see there is not so much a positive pull where that certainly happens, right? So you're in high school and you're saying, oh, well, I can learn Java and someone's going to pay me $200,000 a year. Like, that sounds pretty cool. I can get online, or, I can download a pirated copy of whatever software and, all right. So I don't know that it was a pull where that was certainly part of it. I think a big piece of it, and again, in understanding the complexity of the systems that we've created, I think a huge piece of it was really a push away. The development industry and land use, the barriers to entry started off kind of high. I mean, it's a capital intense, Stringer Bell is a good example, right? So like, he didn't start getting into development when he had $100 or 200. It was like, okay, well, I can give you a duffel bag full of cash and we can make something happen. So the barriers, we're talking about buildings, but even a house, in the smallest unit, the financial cost is pretty high. I mean, you're starting off in the hundreds of thousands of dollars or $100,000, a six-figure barrier to entry. I think if coding had a six-figure barrier to entry, I think you would see far fewer people in coding. I don't think you'd be able to have a coding camp where all you need is, laptops and access to the internet and one person to teach 50 people. I mean, I think the barriers to entry started off high, and I think they're getting higher. I think the complications, the regulation, people in America want to sue everybody, and the barriers to entry are getting higher. And so I think what you're seeing is and I have no science to back this up, but I'd be willing to bet the percentage of development or land use investment that goes through entrepreneurial, small scale, incremental developers has shrunk vastly over time. And again, I don't think anybody went out and said, oh, I want to live in a world where only the biggest developers can do this work. But in Durham, I mean, this is a great example. You walk down these streets, a lot of these buildings were smaller buildings, Main Street buildings, and they were built by, the doctor, wanted a place to build his practice, or the banker knew somebody, invested, or somebody, built a duplex or a quadruplex home down the street, and it was 4 homes in one, Yeah.
And I mean, Durham in particular, has a Black Wall Street, history of particularly, Black entrepreneurs doing exactly that, being able to come and build entire ecosystems of commerce with their own capital. And you're right that most of the stuff that's coming online now is, are bigger firms, not a lot of local entrepreneurs are putting those together.
And that goes back to, we talked about the psychology of people. People say, well, I'm so sick and tired of Starbucks being the only place to get a cup of coffee. I wish there was more, BU cafes of the world. And I don't like talking in specifics, so I'll take that back. But I'd be willing to bet if you talk to most small business owners, it's really hard for them to own their space. It's really hard. I mean, one of the examples that I'll talk specifically to something I experienced is we were working on a development, and during the approval process to get our plans approved, we went from it's screening around the rooftop mechanical units, so the big air conditioning units on top of the building. When we submitted our plans, they said, you don't need the screening. And we said, great. We went on. And then later came back and said, well, you do need the screening. So that doesn't sound like much, but that one change was $60,000. And so if you are a small scale entrepreneur and you're just starting off and you're trying to stand up a little business, and there's this option of the swing financially being to the tune of tens of thousands of dollars. And that's one little element of a very large process. If there's those types of swings, it's almost impossible. And the implications on development, because, and this is one aspect that I don't think, and maybe this was one of your questions, I think it probably was, but which I wish people more understood, was the risk component of development. It's extraordinarily risky, and it's because of debt and leverage and kind of how the financial structures work. If you're a small scale business, if you and I start a business and we want to go out and build a little office building or a little retail store for ourselves, again, if we go get the financing and we talk to all our friends and family and we raise, $200,000 and the bank gives us $800,000 and we've got $1 million, but then there's this $50,000 bust that we don't see coming, that's coming out of you and me. And $50,000 on $1 million doesn't seem like much, but $50,000 on the fact that we had to raise $200,000, that's a 25% swing. And oh, by the way, we only had $10,000 to start with. And all of our investors are going to say, well, I'm not paying that. You know, you're the developer. You were supposed to know about these things. You're going to have to come up with the 50, and I don't have it. So now my project fails, and I've signed a guarantee. And you and I, who wanted to, we wanted to start our retail dreams, we're bankrupt, and it's over. And so we're going to go around and we're going to tell our friends, hey man, listen, you want to come to our town and do development and start your own thing and be entrepreneurial. It's tough. It's rough. It's not worth the risk. And that just stops people from doing it. So again, I think that's the push that you see. And if it were, and I don't know that it needs to be super easy, because again, the externalities are very real. And there's externalities in tech, right? If you and I invent some software that can hurt a bunch of people,
it's been done.
It has been done. But I think what you're seeing there, back to the tech, and I think that's a great question. I'm going to have to think a lot more about that, is the barriers to entry are high and getting higher, and the barriers to entry in technology are just so low. I mean, again, you and I are sitting here with, a couple $100s in equipment and can make this thing that goes out to, the world. That's amazing. I wish. And again, there are solutions. Like there are places where the barriers are smaller, and there are incremental developers out there that are getting it done. But the friction is so high and the risk is so high that a lot of people, if given an option to do anything else, are choosing that. And so then again, that's where you're saying, if you wish there were more local shops as a community, and you're not cheering and
investing.
Well, and again, not to say you have to write the check, but if you're not talking to your elected officials and say, what are we doing to make it easier for Justin to open up a store? I like Justin. Justin's awesome. He's got these cool ideas. What are we making it? I want to see more Justins of the world on Main Street. What are we doing to make that feasible? And because right now it's in a lot of places, it's, oh, Justin has access, or, his family had this building and he wants to open up a store, but it was, a warehouse. And if you're going to change it from a warehouse to a store, that means you're going to have to add 15 parking spaces. And Justin says, well, my parcel doesn't have room for parking spaces. That's fine. Just tear down half the building. And you're like, well, I don't want to do that. Like this, I want to keep the original building, and I just want to open a store. No, sorry, that's the rule. The rule is the rule. You have to have parking. And so it's stuff like that.
And that kind of goes to the externalities too, because if not only are the rules telling you have to have parking, but potentially the culture of the city is telling you we want parking. We are accustomed to being able to drive into downtown and parking right on the road in front of your business. And so, that it is the barriers to entry, I think, is a really good point to think about. I'd love to, and I realize during this conversation that there are so many aspects of development, but I think it would be interesting to give sort of a high-level overview of the development process. Mm-hmm. Like if you and I are going to open that, that dream shop that we've been talking about for weeks, what are the steps that go into making that happen? From we see a plot of land that we're interested in to we're open on Monday for business. What does that look like?
Slightly longer than that, but I mean it's. There's a lot of steps to the process. It can go many different ways, but I think, it always starts with a vision. I mean, no matter what you do, it's got to start with an idea, and then the rest of it is execution. And I think that the two kind of main components are pushing that vision forward and mitigating risk. I mean, so your idea starts off as this big thing, and then over time you hit constraints and changes, and it gets kind of whittled down into what works. And that's the name. The best development that doesn't at the end of the day work is irrelevant. I mean, if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter, right? Because you can have this great idea, but you can't have 3/4 of a building. You can't. I mean, it has to at the end of the day work. And so I think we talked about risk earlier. A lot of what developers think about is. And people think about developers as being super risky, and most developers that I know are comfortable with risk, but they are always thinking about mitigating risk everywhere you get. Just how can we get rid of all the risk possible? And again, I think that's what drives some of the results that you see. You're like, well, why did they do that? I can almost guarantee it had something to do with risk. And back to the Starbucks versus the local folks. Well, it's less risky to sign a lease with a big firm that has 10,000 stores than Justin's. But anyway, so the process. You either typically have a use looking for a site or a site looking for a use. And so again, you kind of come into one of those. If you had an uncle or aunt who left you, a tenth of an acre somewhere, then you can say, okay, great, I've got this site. That's my first constraint. Now I need to go figure out what I can do here. What is my investment that will have the highest and best use here? And that can mean straight up financial, or that can mean this is my value matrix. But at the end of the day, you're going to come up with an idea and a vision, and you're going to have a site looking for a use or a use looking for a site. But either way, you can go down the route of greenfield development, which is buying a piece of land or acquiring or getting control of a piece of land that has not been developed, or kind of adaptive reuse, which is there's something there, and either you're going to tear down what is there and build on top of, you're going to take what is there and just kind of rebuild the interior, or you're going to add on. And again, you see all of those components all over the place. But so you have your site, you've got your vision. Typically, you're going to need capital. And one of the things that one of my favorite incremental developers says all the time is, people, when they say, well, I can't be a developer, I don't have money. He says, well, do you have 2x4s? Do you have drywall? Do you have the nails? It's like, no, well, go get capital is one of those assets that most people don't have, just like drywall, just like 2x4s, just like, an architect's degree, or architect's license, I guess. You've got to go acquire those things, and there's lots of different ways to do it. But first and foremost, you're going to need capital. And so typically, most people will not do a deal all cash. So you're going to figure out what capital assets you have that you can get access to, and then you go look for commitments from partners or other equity investors to get the equity component. When you have enough equity, you can also go out and look for debt or get a loan. Again, that's typical. That's the system we've built. Is most development happens is leveraged, meaning that there's a debt component. And again, that's one of those risk components. I've got to build something. Now I've committed to a lender. I've committed to partners. They're not giving me money for fun. They want a return. And so in that aspect, you've got to come up with a plan that's going to work and it's going to cover the commitments that you made up front financially. So you go look at capital. You say, where are the whether it's a for rent or for sale product, you've got to look at what is the outcome environment, what is the sale potential, what is the rent that you can achieve. Because again, another saying is if you can't get the rents, you can't build the building. So you might say, oh, I'm going to build this super fancy retail space, right? So you and I are going to open a store. We're going to be in half the building, and we're going to have a tenant in the other half, and we're going to charge that tenant $10,000 a month. Well, if that's not what the market supports, we can build it with the finest finishes and imported marble and all this stuff, but you can't force the market to give you what you want. You have to you're kind of at the will of the market, and that's where I think, again, another thing that people don't understand is like developer greed comes up a lot. And you say, well, you make all this money. I think if developers knew that they were going to make a lot of money, that wouldn't be a problem, but other people would know that too, and that competition would quickly kind of evaporate all of that excessive profit. But I think what happens a lot is it's so hard to do the thing that we're trying to do that you and I sit and say, we're going to build this building, it's going to be retail, it's going to be 5,000 square feet, we're going to take half, we're going to rent out the other half. When we start that rent, we build our financial model and we say that rent is going to be $4,000 a month. And we go, great, we build the thing, but then 3 years later when we're finally done, the market could have changed. It could now be $6,000 a month. And we're like, great, look at this. Now we're getting double what we thought. That's a good thing for us. Could be a bad thing for other people. Back to the externalities of now market rents on Main Street are twice what they were 3 years ago. But it could also go the opposite direction. We could build this thing, and now what we thought was $3,000 a month in rent is $2,500. And there's literally nothing we can do to change that. We've already made the commitments. We've signed all the documents. The ship has sailed. We have a building. We've got to make do or deal with the ramifications. So anyway, that's the risk component. But you go out, you get a vision for what you want to do. You've got to check back to the zoning and entitlements piece. Zoning tells you what is allowed there. So can we even build a retail? Can we build a commercial building here? Can it be retail? If it is retail, what are the requirements set upon us that we have to meet. If it's not kind of in the box of what's allowed, you can go through a rezoning or an adjustment to the zoning, or there's a whole bunch of different processes which we don't need to get into. But you can go to the city and say, hey, listen, we really kind of petition the city and say, we really want to do this thing. You as a city have said you want more Main Street retailers. We're a Main Street retailer. Can we have permission to change? And
is that a, so when you go and ask the city for that, one, is there a cost built into it? And two, is it a change in law, or is it a specific permit that I'm allowing for this one-time adaptation of the land use?
So it depends. Sometimes it can be changing the zoning for an area or a district, or sometimes if you're in, again, we talked about the Durham County, Durham City thing, but sometimes there's this annexation where, listen, I want to be part of the city of Durham, but my land is currently out in the county. You have to be annexed, but I want water and sewer, and I want the infrastructure and the support, the amenities of the city, and I'll pay taxes to the city. So then there's this whole annexation. It depends. It's complicated. Sometimes it's a variance, and it's just asking for permission. Listen, you told me my building has to be 10 feet from the street. Again, if it's a hand-me-down building, it's just 5 feet, and that's what it is. So I'm either going to have to spend $150,000 to move the whole building back or demolish this building. Again, you city, you community have said we want to keep old original building stock. Again, I'm asking, and I know you're doing me a favor, but it's sometimes it's a variance, sometimes it's just permission to do what you want to do. Sometimes it is changing the legal, the laws effectively around what you're trying to do. So it depends. It could be lots of things. You asked about cost. Typically, the direct cost to the process with the city of permits and approvals is there. Well, not typically. It is always there. But that is a small piece of the cost because of all the kerplunk needles that we've put through the tube, it's complicated. And so you need legal representation. You need sometimes engineering representation. Sometimes you need architects to draw up plans, and those are all direct costs and again, back to risk of developer, you've got to pay that money regardless. These people don't work for free. And so I'm going to try and make my case to the best of my ability to get this approval from the city. I've got to come with evidence and to be able to share my vision. And I can do it without all those things, but probably not a great idea. And in that, though, there's also an additional component of risk. So you can make your case and you can spend $100,000 on plans and documents and help with consultants, and then you can go through the process and it can be turned down. You don't get a refund. You don't, it's so understanding that risk is a large part of that process, because again, if you go in and you think, well, this is likely to happen, so I feel comfortable spending the $100,000, or I have no idea, it's a very different equation. And so that, again, I think is a component that is often overlooked, of just some places make it fairly straightforward of what is expected and what's understood, and there's transparency. And sometimes it's not the flip of a coin, but you just don't know. And those risks are real, and that's money that you have to spend that you don't get back. So it's complicated and it's risky. So yes, there are plenty of costs, and again, that goes back to how can we, if we say we want this as a result, what are we doing as a community to make the barrier to getting what we want? How are we simplifying the system? How are we making the system incentivize what we say we want versus incentivizing something else? Because I think what we have everywhere we go, what you have is a result of the systems you've created. It may not be the result you wanted, but it's the result of the system. You go to places in Europe, they don't move buildings, they don't tear down buildings. That's just in Charleston. Do you want to tear this down? Great. No, you cannot. We've established, and so you don't get buildings torn down. It just does not happen. But there are ramifications for that, and you get a place where there's a lot of 200-year-old homes, but there's other outcomes. So right. So you go through, you have your vision, you go figure out if your vision is feasible and plausible. You look at the financial feasibility, you look at the regulatory feasibility, you get through, you start talking to consultants, you start spending money on design, You start marketing if you're looking for tenants or if you're looking to sell. And then there's just this process of you get to a point of kind of no return. You've signed the loan documents, you've promised again, if this goes, and that's again, the developer's risk is I'm supposed to be the expert here. And so, I asked you for investment money. I asked you to help provide me with the design. I asked you to sign a lease. I'm asking all these things for people. So I'm kind of on the hook if any of those things goes sideways. And that's the big risk. And the reason I think there can be large financial returns is because the risk component is there. If there were no risk, you wouldn't have those financial returns. So anyway, that's part of the story. So then you go through the process. Once you get to the point of, okay, we're going ahead, we've signed a contract for the land, we've said we're going to buy it, or we've bought it, and we've signed the contract with the general contractor, we've got an agreement with the architects and all of our consultants, and then you just go. And in that process, from start and green light, we've got our permits, we've got our plans approved from the city, you go. And until you get to the finish line, I think of it as kind of like a game, I don't know, it's like running the gauntlet, but like there's a whole bunch of people running, there's 2 lines on either side going down, and they've all got those pool noodles, and they're just out there like whacking you with the pool noodle, and your job is to get to the end. And so you don't know what's going to happen, but as you go, all these million little things pop up. And they're
this is kind of after you break ground. You're saying.
After you break, I mean, right before, because there comes a point where you haven't actually done anything yet, but it's go, and because you can't break ground until you've signed the contract,
checked
until
all these boxes.
right, but once you do, right, and then there's no going back. I mean, you've got to get it done, and you've guaranteed the bank that you're going to complete. I mean, that's one of the documents you sign. It's a completion guarantee. If we give you a bunch of money, you're going to do what you said you were going to do with that money, and there isn't a kind of escape hatch. And so then from then on, you go until it's done, and a million different little things pop up. And again, a lot of them are 1 in a million instances. You go to dig that foundation, and there's a gas line, and we had our surveyors and we had our city. Nobody knew that this was here, but it is, and you can't just go back and say, hey, sorry. What are you going to do? How are you going to get past it? It's crazy. But anyway, so that's the gauntlet to the finish line. And then as you get closer to the finish line, you're ready to deliver. You're again looking out to the market to see, hey, who are our tenants? Who are we going to sell this thing to? You're trying to get it leased up. You're trying to get it stabilized. You're trying to close out all the agreements and transactions you made promises on. And then hopefully you get to a point where it's stable and it's operational. And again, it's an asset that will operate and continue to collect rent, or if you sell it and you move on to the next project. But it's a lot of little things along the way, and it's complicated. It's fun, but it can be risky.
When is the opportunity for the community at large to get involved in this process, if there is one at all? I think a lot of times what happens in communities, and I've certainly felt this and expressed my opinion about this, where the previous tenant closes, they're going to sell the building, and then the next thing the new building, there's a developer, the new building's up, and you kind of it all happens in the blink of an eye, and you're wondering, okay, well, like, I don't actually know anyone that really wants this, but like clearly the developer wanted to do it, and so they kind of just like have their way.
Yeah.
Is there an opportunity for communities, aside from the way that they, vote city council members, or like, aside from setting up the system, is there a point in the system that community members can step in and say, okay, the developers say they want to use, get a permit to rezone for this, but like, we don't actually really want that. Is that just on the city to then take that feedback and say, okay, no, you can't do that because the community said we don't want it?
So one, I wouldn't gloss over the community. I mean, the number one thing is vote. Like, get engaged with your elected officials, have conversations with your neighbors, like, figure out, participate in the conversation. We have vote. summarize it as vote, and learn and educate yourself and ask questions. Again, if you want to ask me a question, ask me a question. Google things. I mean, get out there. There's a lot. Most of these things are known. So get engaged with the community process. Vote. This is all very local politics stuff usually. So you don't have to look very far. And again, it's super hard. Like I, as someone who I think is highly engaged in this, I don't go to Raleigh City Council meetings on a Tuesday night for fun. There are a lot of hurdles to community engagement which are real and we need to address. But vote, number one. You made the comment that I don't know if you said developers are going to get their way, but like they're going to do what they want to do. I would push back on that a little bit and say back to the you and I when we build our retail building can't set the rent. We cannot force something to happen. We have power in a situation, you and I, and people do. We have resources, so there's influence for sure. But you and I can't sit across the table and say, hey, we're going to build this retail in this location and we're going to get this rent and it's going to be awesome. And we're just going to be living the life. We cannot make it, you cannot will it to be. So one thing I would say is I'll push back on that a little bit. If that were true, development would be a lot easier. More people would do it and it would be less risky and less profitable and all sorts of things. So it would change drastically. But what I will say is just because when a developer looks back to having the vision, they're looking out and guessing at the future, but the guess is about what is wanted in the future. So again, it may not be what you want, it may not be what I want, but the assumption, the guess, the bet is that it will be wanted in the future. And if that's not the case, the developer will fail. So again, we may not want the Starbucks, but when the Starbucks shows up, are people buying their coffee? That's right. Like we may sit there and say, well, that's not what we want. But then why is there a line out the door? Like somebody wants it, I think. And so I think there's a dynamic there that you need to be aware of, and I think that's very real. And what I think can be done about that is making sure if there is something that is wanted that is not being delivered or is not being received, or if there's a whole group of people out there that are saying we're getting something we don't want, or this is trending in a direction that we don't like, we're losing something that we do want. I think one thing that we can do, and I'm fully aware of all the cost and complexity, and I don't know that it's fair, but like as a community, if we can get together and say, hey, we want to live in a Durham or a Raleigh where somebody can rent an apartment or buy a home for X, or where 25% or 35% or 95% of our downtown is this type of store or this type of business. This is what we want. Or we love these old buildings and we don't want anybody to ever tear them down. Like there is community impact. And if the developer, if I put my developer hat back on and I'm looking out into the community and I'm seeing this is what's wanted, this is where the demand is, I'm going to flock to the demand. That's my business is
building things that people want.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, and again, it may not be what you want. It may not be what I want, but somebody wants it, or else it might get built once,
right,
but it doesn't get built twice. Nobody's going to do that. And again, I don't know the answer. But if we as a community could get together and cast a community vision to say, again, I want 50% of Main Street to be local retailers. And right now we're at 60% or 40% and it's trending in the wrong direction. Get together with your 10 best friends and say, what are we doing? Where's the roadblock? Where is the pressure that's pushing these folks away? Or the change, what's happening that's driving this? Because again, developers are in the business of meeting demand. And if we can get together we can get together as a community and say, this is what we want, they'll flock to it. And you never see that. You see plenty of instances where developer has an idea, community says, we don't want it. But I would love to figure out how can this neighborhood says, listen, we want a grocery store here. We want food. I want to be able to walk to a grocery store or bike. This is what we want. And then you say, well, what's stopping that from happening? And again, if you ask that question, well, the average, Harris Teeter needs this many rooftops within a 1 mile radius before they will sign a lease for a place. Do we have that? No. How can we get that? Or if it's not a Harris Teeter, it's a small local, bodega type store. Is that legal today? No? Okay. What can we do to, because there's a big, maybe the demand is there, but it's not legal. You're not just straight up not allowed to build it. And then you say, okay, what can we do? Because again, developers are beholden to the community and beholden to demand. And elected officials are beholden to the community and beholden to demand. And so again, I think it's easy to look out and say, well, we don't have power as a community. But man, I think we could do a world of good if we got together and say, listen, we're telling you this is what we want. Nobody has to guess. There is no guess. This is what we want, and we're gonna break down barriers that are keeping that from happening. I don't know if that's the answer, but it seems pretty cool and exciting to me.
Yeah, there is a certain amount of community engagement that often doesn't happen, and I'm 110% guilty of this, where I see something I don't like, and my first instinct is to get on Twitter and say, I don't like this, and I tag all the people, the different accounts that I feel have, slighted me in some way, and say, hey, this is whack, I don't like this. But then the follow-up doesn't ever happen. It's not like, hey, I don't like this, I'm going to make sure that I come to the next city council meeting and address the council and say, hey, I've been talking to my neighbors, and we've all decided that like this project that has been proposed is not what our community needs. What can we do to fix that? And so you're right to say that, the developers are going to places where they are wanted in sort of maybe not even in the abstract, but they're going to build things that are going to, one, be viable for them, and two, be places where people patron. And so, I think about that, like a lot of the places that get built, I think somebody on Reddit tried to call me out on this, that, even if there are places that I'm maybe wasn't a fan of their development at first, like I certainly go into their building and, eat at their restaurants and, buy things from their retail stores. And so, I'm only so principled in that regard. But yeah, I think that the follow through on saying, okay, we do or don't want these things, how do we manifest them through the process that's available to us, is maybe where, a lot of us fall short. And it's not to say that there aren't, one, people out there trying, two, that people don't have crazy lives that they're living. They're not thinking about showing up at city council meeting when they're like, I got to work to pay off rent or student debt or whatever. So I absolutely get that. But there is an amount of coalition building that I think would really help strengthen our communities to get more of what we want from development.
And I would charge people, and again, I'm very much aware of those dynamics too, of like, Jed, you're sitting here putting it on the community to show up and do all this work collectively. And that's a huge ask, but maybe not collectively. Yes, collectively, but also individually. Like, instead of saying, hey, developer, hey, I think what you're doing is whack. If I came up to you and said, I don't like that shirt, I think that shirt is whack, are you going to be receptive to me at all?
Probably not.
Probably not. If I came up to you and said, tell me why you picked that shirt. Now we're in a conversation. Now we have an engagement. Now we're talking. If you go up and say, why is it that you're building, again, in my world, I'm in this neighborhood, and this neighborhood is saying, this is not what we want. We don't want this. And then you're here building this thing that we don't want. Why is it that you're doing that? What is it that is leading you in that direction? And ask the question. Well, it's, you say you want smaller units, you say you want more of, like, these are the hurdles, these are the barriers that are in my place, in my way to do that thing, and this is the path of least resistance. And I have, again, risk, I have a family to feed, there's all these things, I'm trying to mitigate risk. So you're asking me to go one way or the other, it's the Robert Frost, I guess, path less traveled, but that to me is an interesting question of what's stopping you from to me, I'm hearing all this demand, and you're a developer, you are responsive to demand. Why aren't you responsive to this demand? And there's probably some answers there that may surprise people.
Yeah, I think about this with housing. I've been having more conversations with folks around affordable housing, and one of the things that I've learned that definitely reshaped the way that I think about what's happening in this area is that, the lack of housing, the lack of supply, has created this huge like absence of certain types of housing. And so folks who would otherwise, buy this type of home in this neighborhood are like, okay, well, that doesn't exist for me, so I'm going to go into this neighborhood and buy this type of home and either, flip it or do whatever. And it changes the dynamic of a community. And then a lot of folks see that and they're like, this is so terrible. Folks are coming in here and flipping homes and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, we also, at least I know I've been a part of this chorus, have said for a long time, like every time a new apartment building goes up in downtown Durham, I'm like, that's whack. I don't want any more. Yeah, not in my downtown. And not making those, not making the correlation between, okay, if I say I want this neighborhood to be more affordable, then I need to create more housing for the people who would otherwise, take that housing as opposed to gentrifying this neighborhood. And those are the externalities that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. And it's, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but it's a complex system, and I'm saying, I realize like every time I'm about to say something, it's me reflecting on my own thought. I'm like saying it out loud so that I will hear it, that you are not going to get everything that you want in the growth of a city. There's there are all these places where, I may not love that this thing is happening, but in the bigger picture, like it will actually give me 90% of what I want in my community. And so that's the give and take that we have to have sometimes. And it's tough, for a certain number of folks in Durham. We're used to it being one way, and it's rapidly changing into this other way. And it doesn't mean that we can't still have the things that we want. It just means that they will look slightly different than they did before. And, the idea that, like it's unaffordable to live downtown. It's like, well, you couldn't even really live downtown 10 years. There were no places to live. Like those apartments didn't exist. There were hotels and a couple like small, privately owned apartments, but, there was no downtown. So you can't say that it was affordable because it didn't exist. And so just trying to, reframe the conversation a little bit, realizing you can't always, get everything that you want. And sometimes, giving away a little bit in some area actually gives you more of what you want in another, and understanding that, complex system, but sort of trying to understand it can help build a better attitude towards community development, and also empower people to take more action and feel like they can have an impact on what's happening around them.
Well, you bring up a good point. If change is scary, and I am not a fan of change. Change scares me. But it's really hard to see the future and predict what that's going to look like as a citizen, as someone around town. And you can, I think it's often human nature to like, you see the downside much more clearly. Back to our little retail example of like, well, this could be some store that I don't like, but also could be this awesome little thing that, and if we could run the numbers and like how many of those stores, because if the community really doesn't like that store, is it going to stay in business? If there's no demand for that thing, like, right, you could open it up, but you're going to fail. And so again, why is it that in these places, in these cities, in these communities, you find a lot of coffee shops and a lot of record store and a lot of, local things in smaller places in near where their customers are? Because that's most likely what's going to happen. Could other things happen? Absolutely. But it's hard to see the future for anybody. Change is scary. And right, the dynamics of development and affordability, like and this is a whole nother, we don't even need to get into it, but like development happens on the margin, meaning that as soon as a development will happen when there's demand for it, and kind of not before. You can't really precede the demand. You can come later on, but again, in neighborhoods where you see, home prices escalating in huge ways, that's because there is this pent up demand. And again, you might not like it. Or maybe the homeowner likes it. Like, okay, if I own a house and my home goes up 20% in value per year, that's good for me. But what that signals to me is that's a catastrophe, because that just means the demand is so much higher than supply. And if we as a community say we want to grow, which again, if we polled everybody and said, do we want to grow as Durham, as the Triangle, as Raleigh, wherever, and we say yes, then if we're also not making spaces for those people, then we're going to have a problem. And that's, I think, what we're seeing. We've made this great place, and we've instigated all of this growth, but we haven't kept up with the demand. And again, I don't like, like a $2,000 apartment or a $3,000 apartment or this, high rise. But if you think about it, in a development, in a dense development, a 300 unit apartment complex, if they are super duper expensive, if you didn't have that thing, those 300 households would still go somewhere. And again, as a community, have we gotten together and say, well, we would rather have that happen on 3 acres or 10 acres or 15 acres, or would you rather have 300 households on 300 acres? Because those have different outcomes. And again, the economics of it, if you're talking at the margin and you're talking people who can afford to live anywhere or in lots of places, they're probably going to find a solution. But we've got to balance that and figure out, again, what's the goal? What are we trying to achieve? We want to make it affordable to live here. We want to have local commercial ownership. We want to have people have the option to buy. And again, a 2x4 costs what a 2x4 costs. The developer, the contractor, nobody can change it. If we could will 2x4s to change in price, we would. But so that means that a building, a home, has a cost. And so if you're saying we as a community want more $150,000 homes, either you're going to have to find a market solution that meets that need. And in today's environment, that's probably going to be small. Probably going to not take up a lot of land, because land is expensive. And again, land is just land. It's expensive because there's more people that want it than have it. There's a demand imbalance. But so if that's not an acceptable solution, then you've got to get into the subsidy conversation. And then you say, well, are we going to pay for that? You and me going to pitch in for that? And if the answer is yes, then great, let's do it. If the answer is no, I don't want to pitch in for that, but I also don't want to change the rules so that you can have small homes on tiny, then we sit and we get the status quo and things get worse.
I really appreciate everything that you shared. I realized that you mentioned this at the top, that we could talk about any of these things ad nauseum, and I would love to have you come back and talk more about development and particularly how like communities can get more involved in the development process. But I would love to give space for you to talk about some of the work that you're doing now and how people, you said that people can ask you questions. Mm-hmm. You do have a newsletter that you write, a podcast of your own as well. So talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing now and how people can engage with you.
Sure. So I guess the alias or moniker is Oak City CRE. So OAKCITY CRE for commercial real estate. If you go to oakcitycre.com, that's my website. You can find me on Oak City CRE at Twitter, at Oak City CRE on Twitter. To me, those again are all avenues. I think I've always focused on a very small geographic footprint of Raleigh or the Triangle. And again, in my neighborhood and in my city and in my community, I think that's where, one, the changes impact me most and my kids and, my family and you. And so I think, but that's also where we have the most ability to impact change. Kind of starts in your own backyard thing. So I love having conversations. I love asking questions, love answering questions. Although people, it's usually me asking questions. So I love to ask questions. If you want to engage, Twitter's the best place to find me, or the website. The Top 5 is my weekly newsletter that goes out on Tuesdays. And again, that's just kind of 5 articles or links or pieces of content related to development in Raleigh. So if you're interested in learning about development in Raleigh, check out oakcitycre.com, and there's a newsletter tab at the top. But really, I mean, again, and the biggest thing, the call to action to folks, if you're listening to this and you have a question about development, about real estate, about land use, ask somebody. If you want to ask me, oakcitycre@gmail.com is the email. It's all Oak City across everything, but Oak City CRE. So ask the question, and again, if you want to do a follow-up episode, we can have people submit conversations and questions, but engage in the conversation, participate, educate yourself. And again, I think in this, most of the questions have answers. There are very few things that we talk about in land use that don't have an answer. So that would be my call to action. Ask a question. I'm happy to answer it. Twitter is the best place to find me. I spend too much time on Twitter. If you engage with me on Twitter, you'll probably get some questions thrown back at you, because I love asking questions, because I love finding out what the answers are. And again, so much of this is subjective. It's opinions. And this is, I think this is better than that thing, and you think that thing's better than this thing. And that, to me, is the tension of community and of cities. And I think other people have said it better than me, but like a lot of the purpose of cities is congestion, right? It's bringing people close together so that you can sit in a room and record a podcast, or sit in a coffee shop and have an idea and hatch a plan and start a business, or start a relationship, or a friend. Being around people is a positive most of the time, and kind of net. There's some negatives, there's some tension, but I think a lot about in land use and in life. A lot of the things that we discuss are not problems to be solved, but tensions to be managed. Because again, right, it's not black and white and cut and dry. If we say no to that big apartment building, does that are those people going to go someplace? Sure. If we make development super duper hard here, are those people coming out of school who are really smart and driven and care about Durham or Raleigh, are they going to pick a different path? Are they going to go into some other industry? And so again, it's just a tension to be managed. There is no right answer. There is no complete solution that it's just, this is the silver bullet that's going to make it done. But I think if, as a community, we can get together and point out to a North Star and say, this is where we want to go. This is the result that we want to see. Let's build a system that pushes us towards that result instead of away. And that doesn't happen without engagement, without getting involved, getting dirty. So anyway, happy to answer questions. I love talking about this stuff. This is my favorite thing in the world. So thank you for the time to talk about that. If you got questions, shout out.
Yeah, I love that we're ending on this idea of community engagement. That sentiment is how Durham, I think, was built, and the way that we've created the value system that we have is through community engagement. And so I hope that folks, new and old to Durham, return to that sentiment of community engagement. Now, obviously, the pandemic had created some barriers for us to engage with one another, at least in person. But yeah, that community engagement piece is really important, which, it's how all of these tensions that you mentioned will solve themselves, or at least become, we'll be able to work through them together. So yes, please vote, get out, talk to your community members, talk to your city council folks. If you have the time, go to the meetings. They do stream them. There are ways to plug in. So definitely take the time to do that if these types of issues are important to you. And thanks for listening to the show. This has been another episode of the Buddy Ruski Show. I'm really excited for you all to continue to hear these conversations. They're wonderful for me. I learned so much doing this, so that's part of the reason that I do it, and I hope you do too. If you know other folks that could get something out of this content, please share the podcast. You don't even have to post it on your social media feed. You can just send a text with the link. That kind of peer-to-peer sharing is something that I actually really love to hear from folks. So yeah, share it out if you know someone that would appreciate it. You can follow me at Buddy Ruski pretty much anywhere, buddyruska.com. I have a website as well. Do some writing, newsletters there. You can find the podcast there and all the links and everything. So check that out, and we'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening.